Okay. So our third speaker today is Dr. Edward Spang. He is an assistant professor at Department of Food Science and Technology and serves as the associate director of the Center of Water and Energy Efficiency at UC Davis. One of the components of his current work at UC Davis involves estimating and valuing water and energy savings achieved by reducing food losses and waste. He's also pursuing research on community-scale energy production from food waste with a focus on decentralized anaerobic digestion systems. Today, he's here to talk about stranded resources and understanding on-farm losses. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Spang.
Thank you very much, Harwinder, and the whole committee for organizing this. This is a great event, and I'm very happy to be here from California. I've actually never been to Guelph before, so I do appreciate the nice light snowfall you've provided for me. Perfect location. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about on-farm losses. I'm going to go down the food chain a little bit if I have time to talk about an anaerobic digestion project we're working on campus as well. But I'll start on the farm side. Just like Martin mentioned, I'm happy to stop and talk a little bit if you have a question or you want me to explain something better. So feel free to raise your hand while I'm talking. I don't mind that at all. The objective of my talk is to talk a little bit about food loss and waste measurements, talk about qualitative on-site farm loss research that we've done, another effort where we looked at national level farm losses for the United States, and then finally, if we have time, talk about the Food to Fuel and Nutrients project that we have. This is where I work. It's the Robert Mondavi Institute of Wine and Food Science at UC Davis. You guys are all welcome to visit if you'd like to come sometime. We enjoy having visitors. So Harwinder talked a bit about my bio. I'll zip through this stuff, but I really have a dual role on campus. I came to campus to help start a research center called the Center for Water Energy Efficiency. And so I spent a lot of time looking at how water and energy resource systems are linked, and how if we employ water conservation interventions, how does that translate to energy savings and vice versa? And so an example of why that matters in California is that we have about $1 billion available every year to spend on energy efficiency. And we have $1 billion to spend every year on top of that other $1 billion to spend on greenhouse gas reduction. We have no such statewide fund for water conservation. And so if we could start to show some of the embedded energy savings, the embedded greenhouse gas savings in water conservation, we can direct funds for energy efficiency and greenhouse gas reduction towards the water sector and try to accomplish multiple goals at once. Then I was hired into the Food Science and Technology department because they were hearing from their students and hearing from industry that they wanted to have more people that were trained in understanding not just food, but the embedded resources in food and how we produce food more efficiently. And so I brought my water and energy background into the food sector, and I've been learning ever since. So when we talk about food loss and waste, and I do want to thank Martin and Mike for doing a great job introducing a lot of the concepts and saving me a little bit of time at the front end of my slide deck here. But really, there's no real reason not to get behind reducing food loss and waste. No matter who you are, you can probably save some money. You might be able to reduce food insecurity. You can increase resource use efficiency, and you potentially can reduce greenhouse gases. So no matter who you are in the supply chain, you do have some opportunity for savings. And this is another one, I don't have to go into too much detail. We have to think in terms of food loss and waste, we want to think about where it's going. It matters where it's currently going. Okay, you have to understand the baseline. Is it going to a landfill? Well, if we move it up the hierarchy of recovery solutions, as Mike mentioned, it's a little bit better. So if we go from incineration to composting, that's a benefit, right? So we really have to understand where we're headed with the waste before we can come up with good solutions for reducing or recovering or recycling food loss and waste. So I was in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago where we were meeting about how best to manage or measure food loss and waste. And there's lots of discussion on this, just like there's discussion on how we define it, as Mike did a great job introducing. There's a lot of discussion on how we measure it. There's lots of methods. We can use surveys, diaries, interviews, go out and just go through bins, go to a processing line and measure the volume of this waste. And then we can talk about it in terms of extensive metrics. What's the absolute amount? Or intensive, what's the percentage amount? Or percentage per different franchise of a restaurant. We want to understand where the waste is occurring. What's the geographic location? Or what's the node in the supply chain that we're looking at? because, again, that's going to translate into what solutions we can think about. And finally, we want to know what food type. Food loss and waste differs by food type, whether it's a grain, fruit or vegetable, meat, oil. They all have different kind of rates of losses across the food supply chain. And then finally, we have some of these sort of subjective terms in terms of food loss and waste. Is it avoidable or unavoidable? And who's defining that? Is it edible or inedible? And who's defining that? So there's lots of questions just in the food loss and waste measurement itself. However, we also want to know why it's being lost or wasted. We have to understand the driver of loss. So this, not only do we need to know the amount and how we're measuring it, but what is the reason behind it? So if we think about in the field, and this is tilted a little bit more towards harvest and post-harvest, but we have weather, losses from weather, losses from temperature and humidity on the field and in storage, infrastructure and logistics, so whether the roads are in good condition, whether the cold chain is operational, and then market conditions. Mike mentioned that as well, that sometimes the market price really affects how much food is going to be, or crop is going to be left in the field at some points. Finally, the other piece that's always challenging is behavior and consumer choice. And it takes a lot of work to understand what's going on in our brains because we are affected by a lot of different things at the same time. Our social backgrounds, our income level, our perceptions of the environment and of food itself. And so there's lots of different dynamics as to why food loss and waste is happening across the supply chain. And then finally, we need this other piece. Where is it currently going? What's its current destination? And so while we need to measure things better, we also need to put all these pieces together so that we have better information for decision making, right? So the food loss and waste, we get an understanding of amount. But what do we do about it? We need to have all of these pieces put together. We need to understand the amount and where it was, but what caused it and where it's going and what the opportunities are for changing its destination for disposal. So if we think about the driver, that's really where we're going to find opportunities for prevention, right? We're kind of, instead of, you're kind of diagnosing the root solution instead of just trying to patch it at the end, try to fix something at the end that's always going to keep happening. We're trying to get to the root cause and prevent it in the first place. For the food loss and waste data, understanding where it is in the supply chain and how many resources have been used for it, that's going to help us value the waste beyond just its potential economic value. We can understand how much water is embedded in that waste, how much energy. So we can start to make better decisions in terms of different interventions about how we're recovering those embedded values. And finally, the same kind of approach is taken towards the food loss recovery hierarchy, is understanding the value of the material and energy recovery. So that if we take, from a processing plant, we take a bunch of tomato pumice and we send it to animals, what is that relative to putting it to an anaerobic digester? What are the trade-offs there? So while the overall recovery hierarchy suggests that there's this certain order to things, there's certain circumstances where it might be better to pursue an industrial use of that waste instead of feeding animals. There might be situations where economically that's more valuable. So while the hierarchy is very useful overall, I would encourage you to think that it's relatively site-specific in terms of what the actual best use is for a particular material in the supply chain. All right, so if we look across the supply chain, most of today I'm going to be talking about the ag production side. And so you might recognize this picture from Martin's presentation, actually, because it was startling. I think this one really inspired us. We were working with the World Wildlife Fund, and they actually showed me this picture of tomato losses. And so we decided to work with the World Wildlife Fund and a number of growers in California looking at tomatoes, leafy greens, and peaches. And we wanted to understand how much was being lost, but we really wanted to understand why it was being lost. We spent a lot more time on the driver's side of this, and we really wanted to get the opinions of the growers themselves. And so going back to what Mike was talking about, food loss and waste, the terminology matters. When we first started reaching out to growers in our region and we said, hey, we're researchers working on food waste, we didn't get very far talking with the growers. And so we kind of reconvened, we sat with our team, and we said, this is not going anywhere because saying food waste certainly sounds like we're pointing the finger at the growers and the agricultural community, that there's losses that could be avoided and they're just not handling it. And so we reached back out. This time we erased our title and we wrote Maximizing Farm Utility. All of a sudden, people started picking up the phone and talking to us. So really how you frame the issue, you have to understand that your audience, you have to understand what the shared vision, the shared goal is between the researchers and the particular people you're working with. So we conducted 33 interviews, we visited 21 farms, and we also looked at what the key water and energy and other inputs were at these farms. So we were doing this sort of combined interview approach to understand losses and drivers of loss, but also trying to get to some of those value components I mentioned before. How much have we invested in these crops to grow them in terms of resources? So the interview results, I won't go through step by step, but we really differentiated between what are called walk-by fields. So this is a situation where you're growing lettuce, and in lettuce, about 50% of the cost of growing lettuce is in harvesting the lettuce, okay? So if the price of lettuce drops below what you can afford to send people, what you can pay people to go out and get it, you're not gonna go get it. You're not gonna lose money to go get a crop that you then have to sell. So that was just a cutoff. They're not gonna go get that lettuce for that particular round. Then there's the pre-harvest cull. So you can think about this in terms of fresh tomatoes, where you're going out to pick tomatoes and you're looking at the vines, you're grabbing some that might be bruised and you're throwing them on the ground. Okay, so they're being selected out as you're harvesting. And finally, there's the post-harvest cull, and this is more common with peaches, where you kind of harvest everything off the tree and then you sort it out later in a packing shed. So depending on the different crops, we talked about losses at different places. Many times the growers didn't want to provide a value at all. They said it's going to be meaningless if I tell you a value, because one year we won't have any losses at all. Other years, I mean, there'll be a little bit. And other years it'll be 50% because there was a hailstorm and it knocked out half our crop. So I don't want you to take an average from my farm and think that that's something you can plan on, because the variability is so wide that I can't really tell you what a particular value you could expect in any year would be. So that was one thing. We thought there would be kind of a number in mind for most people, but and there were, and we got some numbers, as you can see in the table, but really that strong pushback on getting a number from some of the growers was really interesting. And I just want you guys to keep that in mind a little bit, because we think on the solution side, in fact, when you read in the popular media some ideas about food loss and waste, you'll often see a number for farms, and people will say, well, we'll just sell that as imperfect produce. Well, what if you set up a secondary market to handle that crop, and the next year there is no surplus crop? It makes it hard to come up with solutions when your stream of material is not regularly available and not consistent. This is a little different down the supply chain with processing, where the waste stream tends to be much more consistent, because you might just be processing tomatoes at this one site every year. The process stays the same, and so what comes off the production line as waste can actually be consistent from year to year. And that is why actually in the processing side of the supply chain, we tend to see a lot of this waste be directed to animal feed consistently. They have a plan of getting their waste product to a productive use. So another point I'd like to make here that's kind of interesting that we thought about quite a bit was the fact that what happens when people are kind of new to this topic is that you tend to conflate the driver of loss with the location of the loss. And you need to be careful about that. So we've been talking a little bit about how decision-making and information translates horizontally across the supply chain. So Martin did a good job speaking about that, but if you think about from the grower's perspective, they don't really have control over the price. So that lettuce grower I mentioned before, if the price drops, that's not under their control, and they can't afford to lose money to go get a crop. Weather, very hard to control, okay? They can't control that on the farm. So to some extent, they are operating in a very uncertain atmosphere. And when you're operating under uncertainty, it's hard to get your target of what you're gonna make and what you're gonna sell perfectly every time. So the point there is that there's probably never gonna be zero waste. So what we're really talking about is what is the optimal level of losses? How good can we get? We can probably get better with predictive models. We can probably get better with crops that are more resilient. The likelihood of getting to zero losses on a farm is probably nil. It's not going to happen where there's never going to be losses on a farm. And this goes back to, well, what are losses in the first place? There are some economists that argue it's only losses if it goes to a landfill, because that's truly zero value, where if we till it back into the soil, there's some organic matter going back into the soil, there's some productive use there, there's some recycling of organic matter, okay? So I just threw a lot out at you guys. Do you anyone questions? Does it all make sense? You want me to go back and go over anything? All right, I'll keep going. So here's an example of just, we called this project Voices from the Field, because we really wanted to elevate the grower's perspective into the discussion on food loss and waste. So this quote is exactly what we were kind of talking about before. So it's not just necessarily a walk-by field where it's binary, where the price drops and you don't harvest. You actually can, there's a kind of a continuum of how selective you are for crops based on price. So if there's a really strong demand for tomatoes in the marketplace or for leafy greens, you might get more product out of your field to push it into the marketplace that's really thirsty for that particular crop. If it's a more, if the market's not as hot, you might be a little bit more selective with what you put into your bins and send off to the marketplace. So it's not, like I said, not just a binary, but there's this kind of tension between price and how picky you get with selecting particular fruits by different grades and putting things into the marketplace. Now, for the understanding the resources embedded in these crops, we did what's called a life cycle assessment. I imagine some of you guys are familiar with this methodology, but it's really understanding how to translate an activity or product or process into environmental impacts. And so there's a number of different metrics we use in a life cycle assessment. Water use, greenhouse gas emissions, primary energy use, a number of other measurements. What we're looking at here is global warming potential. So this is basically the amount of embedded greenhouse gas emissions in a particular product. And what we're showing is basically for 3 crops. Now this is romaine, fresh tomato, and processing tomato. And I don't know, well, you guys probably know quite a bit about processing tomato and fresh tomato. I speak to a lot of different groups. As plant scientists, I think I don't have to spend too much time on this, but the processing tomato has a lot lower losses than the fresh tomato because the harvesting is totally different. It's mechanized, and you basically gather it all up together, and you're sending it to a processing plant where they can handle a certain amount of green tomatoes or even moldy tomatoes that just get mixed into making different tomato products. Fresh tomatoes is what you guys would buy at the marketplace. They're much more selective about what they're picking off the vine and putting into either the farmer's market or downstream to distributors and retail. Lettuce has, in our study, had about a 30% losses in fields. Actually, 23% for romaine lettuce, which is on the top, 30% for fresh tomato. So in this example, the fresh tomato was the highest amount of losses, and processing tomato is only 4%. What I want to talk about is the influence of losses on the life cycle assessment. So life cycle assessment is fundamentally, it's a fraction. How much water for a particular kilogram of tomato, for example. We talk a lot about different methods and different techniques to reduce the numerator in that equation. How do we grow more tomatoes with less water, right? How do we grow more tomatoes with less chemical fertilizers? When we think about losses, we're actually thinking about the denominator. How do we get more crops out of the field for the same amount of inputs that we put in at the beginning of the season? And so if we look at the bottom line in each of these crops is what happens, what the life cycle assessment, what that fraction looks like when you incorporate losses into the equation. The upper bar is what would happen if we had full harvest, if every single tomato that we grew was taken off of the field. And so you can see that there's a major impact that losses have in understanding a life cycle assessment. We actually don't talk about this as much in life cycle assessment as we do talk about the inputs themselves. So this has a major influence, and so if we can get better, with our predictive models, we do stand to save a lot of resources upstream. But there's another piece of this puzzle which was kind of interesting. So if we're thinking about that person who's in the field, selecting tomatoes, selecting fresh peaches for the market, they might notice that a particular peach has a scar in it, right? So you're holding it in your hand, there's a scar in it. Will someone buy this? Will someone buy this? If I put it all the way into the supply chain, will it get to a consumer, even get on the retail shelf, and a consumer will pick it up and then put it down again, and another consumer will pick it up, put it down, and then the retailer throws it out? Well, what happens along the line is that a lot more energy is put into that particular peach to get from the grower all the way to the retailer, right? It has to be potentially refrigerated, shipped in a truck, put on the shelf, a lot more labor is invested. So really that decision at the farm to put that scarred peach that people might not like into the supply chain is actually an important decision in terms of the overall environmental impact of that crop. So this particular graphic, this is taken from another study, is just the amount of energy consumption by stage of production in the food system. And so you can see that there's definitely a lot of energy inputs at agriculture on the far left, but there's energy in processing, packaging, transport, wholesale, food services, and households. So the impact of losses of any food product increases as it goes down the supply chain. So actually, if something has to be lost, if no one's going to eat that peach, the best place to lose it is on the farm. It's also much more likely to go back into the soil, whereas anywhere else in the supply chain, it's perhaps more likely to end up in a landfill. It's worst destination, okay? And the growers were aware of this. They brought up this topic with us in our interviews. So they're thinking down the supply chain when they're thinking about their crops. Okay, another one. So that last one was really sort of a bottom-up study where we're actually going and talking to growers and looking at farms. This project or this paper was actually kind of going from the other direction, so more of a top-down study, and we were looking at USDA data. And the USDA data collects data, the USDA collects data through a number of different mechanisms. And what we were trying to do is piece enough data together to get to what I was talking about before, understanding the drivers, understanding the amounts, and understanding destinations, and understanding the embedded resources within. So in one data set, they have the National Agricultural Statistical Service, the NASS. They have acres planted and acres harvested. So that gives us a very rough cut of basically what crops were abandoned in the field that year. But it doesn't tell us anything about harvesting. And so we took another data set, the Risk Management Agency data set, that talks about losses of crops that are, or actually, I'm sorry, it doesn't tell anything about the driver of the loss. So it just tells you whether it was harvested or not, but you have no idea why. So then we looked at the Risk Management Agency that is basically crop insurance, which tells you, was it too hot, too cold, too much water, too little water? And so we started to get some of the reasons behind the losses that were happening in the field. The next thing we didn't know at all from the data was what was harvested and what was not harvested. For potatoes, and this is why we picked potatoes, they actually had done a survey called the Objective Yield Survey, where they walked behind a potato harvester and they grabbed all the potatoes that were over 1.5 inches in diameter that were left behind by the harvester. And so that gave us an understanding of what could be marketable, but it was left behind in the field. And then finally, we looked at another USDA data set that talked about water use. So putting all these pieces together, we could understand what is the amount of water embedded in the potato losses, why were they lost, and how much were lost pre-harvest and how much were lost at harvest. But it took 4 different data sets that aren't usually stitched together to get that sort of complete understanding of what was going on in the United States. So here are the results. I won't go into too much detail here. We have a paper on this in the Journal of Sustainability. But this is kind of a look at quickly what the data look like. So on the left, it's the pre-harvest losses by driver. We got on the right, it's an indication of what were the pre-harvest losses. So that's acres planted, acres harvested, versus harvest losses. And you can see that the harvest losses, walking behind the harvester and picking up those potatoes that could be sold, much greater than the pre-harvest losses in this circumstance. And oh, by the way, these are 7 major potato-producing states in the United States. Those losses relative to total production is shown here. So Idaho is the largest potato-producing state, followed by Washington, and then Wisconsin, North Dakota, Oregon, Minnesota, and Maine. Roughly, the harvest losses range from 3 to 7%. Pre-harvest losses range from about 1% all the way up to 7%. In North Dakota, they had a particularly rough weather year that year, too much precipitation. Then if we look at the water footprint, we have to understand a couple things. We have to understand how much water is applied per productive unit of potato. So we had cubic meters of water per metric ton of potatoes. Then we also had to understand, was that particular state, do they irrigate a lot, or is it mostly rain-fed? So we were focusing on what's called the blue water footprint, which means it's been irrigated. And there's a difference there between a blue water footprint and the other kind of water footprint called a green water footprint, which means the amount of rainfall utilized. We looked only at the blue water footprint because it's more of a competitive use of water. It's water that's ready to go and can be used for a city, it can be used for agriculture. And so we wanted to focus specifically on irrigation. And most of the states irrigate. Idaho and Wisconsin almost entirely irrigate, where Maine is mostly just rain-fed. So that's going to follow through to our water footprint calculation in the end. And here we present it. So basically, you can see that the water footprint of losses in Maine is very low because it's almost all rain-fed, so it's not utilizing blue water. Idaho, it's quite high. That's a function of having a lot of irrigation, but also having a lot of potatoes. And so we made one more calculation, which is the blue water footprint intensity, and it's the amount of water lost in potato losses per total potato production. And so you get an understanding there of kind of the efficiency of potato production from a water footprint and loss perspective all put together. And there, again, we see that Idaho uses quite a bit of water, and there's quite a bit of water embedded in the potato losses from an intensity standpoint. Any questions here? Okay. Happy to send you guys the paper if you're interested. And maybe I'll take just a few more minutes to quickly talk about this last project. So let's see, how do I do this really quickly? In California, we tend to be a little bit aggressive with our environmental policies. We're very experimental in California. And sometimes it works, and a lot of people will copy our environmental policy. Other times it doesn't work, and people will say, wow, I'm really glad California tried that, so we don't have to. So a current policy right now is called our Senate Bill 1383. I'll just jump ahead real quick. And the idea is that we're going to divert 75% of our organic waste from landfills by 2025. And on top of that, we're aiming to recover 20% of edible food. This is a really aggressive policy, and it's really interesting. I think it's important to learn how this is going to play out in California so that people can see whether this is successful and how it works. The part that's really interesting to me is that they decided to include the 20% of edible food recovered. And so what they're trying to balance this idea of capturing these organic waste flows and putting them to productive use, but not at the cost of preventing food recovery. So, trying to carve out in the policy some room to do recovery at the top of the pyramid while also aiming to handle the stuff towards the bottom of the pyramid, okay? The issue is we don't know how much edible food is being wasted. So right here, I was at a sorting effort at a landfill trying to sort through bags of garbage and identify what was edible and not edible. Not a very easy thing to do, actually, at this stage of waste, but they were able to work through it. And again, it's subjective. A lot of times these guys were holding stuff up for CalRecycle, our solid waste management organization, saying, would you consider this edible? And they'd have to have a discussion about whether it was edible or not. Meanwhile, on the 75% reduction piece, we don't have the infrastructure in the state yet to handle that level of diversion. So what is it going to look like? Now I'm getting back to our project. We're trying to understand if we deploy a lot more anaerobic digestion, what scale should it be deployed at? Should it be a number of centralized facilities across the state, or should it be kind of a mesh network of highly decentralized small-scale anaerobic digestion? The answer is probably somewhere in between. But we really wanted to understand, get the metrics behind this new type of anaerobic digestion where it's basically built in a containerized unit. And the benefit of this is that you don't have to transport this heavy waste from one place to another. Ideally, anaerobic digestion allows you to recapture energy, but if you're using all that energy to transport the waste from one place to another, it doesn't really help out that much. So if you can stick one of these behind different processing plants or retail centers where there's a consistent volume of waste, that might be a good solution. However, when you have a decentralized technology like this, you might lose economy of scale. So how does all this play out given the different factors in the different waste streams in California? So that is a project that we're pursuing by the California Energy Commission, and we're going to be deploying this technology down in Southern California in the next 4 or 5 months. So I don't have any results yet, but I did want to just preview this project because we're pretty excited about it, and especially since someone brought up the policy question here. There's a really tight connection between technology and policy on this particular project, and we're pretty excited about it. So with that, I will, one last plug is that we have a group on campus at UC Davis that's starting to emerge as we speak, called the Food Loss and Waste Collaborative. And the reason why I'm excited about this is that we have researchers, faculty, students, staff on campus that are interested in food loss and waste, and we've really kind of tried to pull together as many different disciplinary perspectives on the topic as possible. So we have some information on our website, but it is sort of new. I encourage you to reach out to us if you want to collaborate on projects or just learn what we're up to, but I did want to share this final piece of information before closing out here. So thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here today.